The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. When the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a scholar of the law, tested him by asking, "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" He said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and the first commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. The whole law and the prophets depend on these two commandments." The Gospel of the Lord. Who is this? Jack. Say hi to Jack. Jack says hi back. Jack is very glad to be here. Halloween is Tuesday night, so he wanted to come by as he had for many years and say hello to you. It's amazing that he's here so quickly. You seem like you just blink and Jack's back. It's like your birthday. Every time you look up, it's your birthday. Not so much when you're young. A year is a long time, but as we mature through life, those years just clip by. And so we always appreciate things that help us keep track of time. And one thing we have in this parish to help us track time is Jack. And Jack shows up every year just around Halloween time to say hello. And so we appreciate him being here. The Torah, Torah, is how we spell it in English, the Torah. The Torah is contained in the first 5 books of the Bible. What we think of as the Old Testament, the Jews, we think of it as Hebrew Scriptures, but it's the same Scriptures. The Torah. In those 5 books of the Bible, there are 613 commands, telling people how they are to live in order to be in a righteous relationship with God. The Torah. In the Torah, there are 248 commands, positive ones, telling us what to do. Then there's 365 negative commands. Don't do this, that kind of command, negative. These 613 commandments were referred to as the law. The law formed the foundation for God's people, formed the foundation for them, gave them identity, gave them a common bond. The law, they lived by the law. The law was very complicated, though, with 613 commandments. It's hard to remember all of that. And so in about the year 1000, King David wrote a psalm in order to summarize the law so people could remember it. Psalm 15. In that psalm, there's 11 tenets telling you how to live your life according to the law. There were 2 versions of the Torah. One was an oral one, shared just by mouth. Then there was a written Torah, written down, 613 tenets, and you could read them. The problem is most of the people in those days couldn't read. They couldn't read the Torah. They couldn't read what the law contained, so they needed to help to remember it. And so was that help that King David gave them to help them give them a summary. In chapter 7 of the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says, "In everything do to others as you would have them do to you, for this is the law and the prophets." He's giving them a summary. What do you need to do to live according to the law? In everything do to others as you would have them do to you. This is very similar to a teaching by a famous Jewish scholar at the time named Hillel. Hillel was born in about 40 BC and died about 10 AD, and he lived in Jerusalem and was certainly around during the early life of Jesus. And so what Jesus is saying, do to others as you would have them do to you, is very similar to what Hillel taught. There's a story about a Gentile who wanted to convert to Judaism, but he couldn't read, but he wanted to live according to the law, and it seemed so overwhelming to him. And so he went to Hillel. Hillel had a school and was a very famous teacher. He went to Hillel and asked him, how am I going to live the law if I can't read? How do I do that? So Hillel said, fine, I'll teach you. Stand on one foot. So the man stands on one foot. So Hillel tells him, what is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. That is the whole Torah. While the rest is commentary on it, go and learn it. At which point the man put his foot down. In that short period of time, Hillel had taught him the entire law. What is hateful to you, don't do that to your neighbor. The amazing thing about that approach is that it's so simple. Jesus will criticize the Pharisees of getting lost in all the complexities of the 613 tenets and complaining and criticizing the people because they weren't living them. But Hillel reduced it down, just like King David and just like Jesus will, into a short sentence. Live this sentence, and you will live the law. What is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. It's the whole Torah. It's all there. The wonderful thing about it, in order to follow it, you don't need to read a book. You don't need to be taught some complicated formula, because you already have it in your heart. It's called the natural law. That when we are created, the Lord writes the commandment in our heart. Do to others as you would have them do to you. Everyone knows that. It's not a big insight. And when you hear it, it makes sense and it seems familiar because we already know that. Same thing with Hillel. What is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. So that each of us then becomes our own standard. We become the standard. You don't have to read it in a book. No teacher needs to tell you. Whatever it is you don't like, don't do to your neighbor. It's simple. Simple. If you don't like that, don't do it. Or if you do like it, maybe you ought to do it for your neighbor. But certainly do not do anything that harms your neighbor. So if you don't like something, don't do it to your neighbor. That's the teaching of Hillel. And that's what we hear from Jesus in the gospel today. They're asking him, Lord, what is the greatest commandment? They're asking him, give us a summary like King David did and what Hillel was teaching. Give us a summary of the law. And so Jesus tells them, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and the first commandment. But the second is like it. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself. As you love yourself, love your neighbor. The Greek word for love in both of those sentences is the same. It's the same. Agape. It's a deep love. So not only for God, but also for the neighbor. Those two commandments go together. And it summarizes the law. If you live those two commandments, you will obey the law. Now, the law had various gradations of teachings, of commandments. Honor your father and your mother. That was one of the commandments. It's part of what we call the Ten Commandments. It was in the Torah. Honor your father and your mother. Very important. But also in the Torah, also among those 613 tenets, was a command that if you find a bird sitting on her nest on top of eggs or little babies, leave her alone. Don't bother her. That was one of the tenets. And so there was various kinds of commandments, but there were really important ones and ones that were sort of nice if you did them, but they weren't as important. And so what Jesus is doing then is summarizing for people how you are to live, how you are to live, you live by loving God with all that you have and all that you are, and you love your neighbor as yourself. Love, same word. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. It's very simple. It's not complicated. And so when you see someone, you meet them, maybe it's a stranger, do to them as you would have someone do to you if you were them. You were that person standing on the corner. You were that person in line at the store. Treat them as if that were you. And that way you know what to do. You just feel in your own heart, what would I like someone to do to me? And then do that. Treat that person, or don't treat them in a way that you would find hateful. Don't do that. Because that way we become our own standard. It's not complicated. It's simple. It's profound truth, but it's simple. You can understand it. In another part of the gospel, Jesus will say, the measure with which you measure will be measured unto you. Not complicated. However you measure things out, that's how it will be measured to you. In other words, we're writing our own ticket to salvation. In our Father, we say, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. As you forgive, you will be forgiven. If you do not forgive, you will not be forgiven by God. Simple, easy to understand, but a very profound truth. And so we're reminded today as we hear Jesus in the gospel to not get lost in religion and all the institutional issues that might come up, but to stay on track with what am I to do as a faithful disciple of Jesus Christ. 1, love God with all your heart, mind, and soul. 2, love your neighbor as yourself. If you do that, then you contain all the truth in the gospel, in the law, and the challenge for us then is to do it.